Once the ancients. Till we returned. And the galaxy was unprepared. Part 1. The Relic Signal. The observatory sat at the far edge of known space, a thin metal ring drifting in silence where stars grew sparse and the dark between them stretched wide and cold and without end. Dr. SMR had been stationed there for 11 months. And in 11 months, nothing had happened worth writing home about. She was a xenolinguist, a specialist in dead languages and the forgotten words of civilizations that no longer breathed. And her superiors in the Calder Republic had posted her at the rim of the galaxy as a polite way of telling her that her research did not matter to anyone in power. The Calder Republic had very little patience for scholars who spent their careers studying species that no longer existed. Then the signal came. It arrived without a warning. No buildup, no precursor static. I'd no slow mathematical pattern that most civilizations sent before attempting contact with the unknown. It simply arrived. It came in 71 languages at once, some of them modern, some ancient, or some so old that S's translation software flagged them as corrupted data before she silenced the alerts with a flat swipe of her hand and leaned forward in her chair. She recognized 14 of the languages without any help from the software. 3 of them had been dead for over 400,000 years. She sat alone in the observatory for 6 full hours before she filed her report. Not because she was afraid, but though she was very afraid, but because she needed to be completely sure she had not made some terrible and embarrassing mistake. She had not made a mistake. The signal was a greeting, not a distress call, not a territorial broadcast, not a demand. A greeting. Warm and simple and unhurried. The kind a traveler might send ahead before walking back through a door they had once left open. It came from a single point in space. The Solara Prime system. So 40 light-years from the observatory's position, ESA pulled the archive entry for Solara Prime and read it twice. Sterile, uninhabited, ancient ruins present on third planetary body. Excavation prohibited pending further review. Last surveyed 12,000 years ago. She read it a third time. Then she sent her report to Calder High Command and poured herself a cup of cold tea and sat very still in the dark of the observatory and waited for someone older and more important than herself to decide what to do next. The Joint Observation Fleet arrived at Solara Prime 19 days later. 6 Calder warships and 4 Veth Dominion patrol cruisers, traveling together with the stiff discomfort of 2 rivals forced to share a narrow hallway. Admiral Korath Sel of the Calder Republic stood on the bridge of his flagship, the KRS Vigilant, and stared at his sensor display. And what he saw made him grip the railing in front of him with both hands. The archive said, ruins. His sensors were not showing him ruins. His sensors were showing him a structure the size of a small moon, dark gray and ancient in its geometry, covered in long angular patterns that caught the light of distant stars and held it. And it was spinning, slowly and deliberately, of the way a great machine spins when it has been sleeping for a very long time and is finally waking up. The patterns on its surface were lighting up in sequence, section by section. From the base to the crown, a vast illumination spreading across the structure like a sunrise moving in fast motion. Korath Sel ordered battle stations. He ordered weapons hot. He ordered a tight beam message to the Veth ships to hold position and not fire without his direct authorization. Then he stood at his railing and watched the structure finish waking up. It took 40 minutes. When it was done, the structure sat in the dark of the Solara Prime system like a second sun, radiating energy. Readings that made Korath Sel's chief engineer walk to the command platform in total silence and hand him a data pad with an expression that had no name. Korath Sel looked at the data. The structure was generating more power than the entire combined energy grid of the Calder Republic. He handed the pad back without a word. Then a ship came out of the structure. It emerged from an opening in the structure's upper face, a portal that expanded like a slow eye. and it moved into open space with a calm and easy confidence that carried no urgency and no aggression. The ship was not enormous, roughly the size of a heavy cruiser, but it was unlike any military vessel Korath Sel had ever seen. Its hull was deep silver white and perfectly smooth, curved and continuous, with no visible weapon ports, no armored plating. I know scars from old battles. It looked less like a warship and more like something that had been grown in a quiet place and then sent out into the world for the first time. The ship came to a full stop at an equal distance between the structure and the Calderveth fleet, and it sat there without moving. For 8 minutes, nothing happened at all. Korath Sel kept his weapons hot and his breathing even, and his eyes on the silver-white ship. Then every comm channel across the entire fleet opened at once, encrypted military bands, civilian emergency frequencies, personal communicators in the crew's jacket pockets, the low-frequency research arrays bolted to the outside of the Vigilance hull, all of them opened at the same moment. And a voice came through. It was a human voice in shape, built from 2 lungs and 1 throat. And it was calm, and it was warm. And it was unhurried, in the way that only something very old and very certain can be unhurried. "Hello," the voice said. And that single word landed in the silence of 19 warships like a stone dropped into perfectly still water. "We are humanity. We believe some of you may have heard of us. We would very much like to come home." Nobody on the bridge of the KRS Vigilance spoke. Nobody moved. A junior sensor officer made a small sound and then pressed his hand over his own. A mouth Korath Sel stared at the silver-white ship sitting alone in the dark in front of him. And he thought about the signal broadcast in 71 languages from a system the archive called sterile and empty. And he thought about the structure behind the ship, the size of a moon, glowing with more power than his entire civilization could produce. And he thought about what those 3 dead languages in the original signal meant. Languages that had not been spoken by any living throat in 400,000 years. He thought about all of it for a long moment. Then he told his weapons officer to stand down. Not because he felt safe, but because some old and honest part of him knew, with the kind of certainty that lives in the chest rather than the mind, that weapons would accomplish absolutely nothing here. Whatever was sitting in the dark in front of him was not a threat he could fight. It was something that had existed before the concept of fighting had even been invented in this part of the galaxy. It was humanity. And humanity had decided to come back, and the galaxy, every corner of it, every empire, every collective, every republic, every war council and archive and throne room, was completely and entirely unprepared. #once the ancients, we returned. And the galaxy was unprepared. Part 2. What the archives forgot. The news moved faster than any official statement could contain it. Within 72 hours of the transmission from Solara Prime, every major news network in the Calder Republic was running the story. And within a week, the signal recording had spread to the Veth Dominion, the Soren Collective, and every minor trading state, border colony, and deep space outpost that could receive a long-range broadcast. The galaxy heard the voice, "We are humanity. We would very much like to come home." And the galaxy, for the first time in a very long time, did not know what to do next. The Calder Republic moved fastest, which was what republics with large bureaucracies and even larger anxieties tended to do. And within 3 weeks of the signal, the great diplomatic station of Verath had been chosen as the site of first formal contact. Verath Station hung in orbit above the Calder capital world like a silver crown, wide and layered, built to host 50 delegations at once. The kind of place where wars had been prevented and wars had been quietly started over fine meals and careful words. Ambassador Yael Chen arrived alone. She came in a small shuttle. No escort, no honor guard, and no fleet of warships behind her. and she docked at Varath's outer bay with the ease of someone who had parked in difficult spots before. She was not what the Calder diplomatic corps had expected. She was not tall or imposing or surrounded by visible technology. She was a woman of middle age with dark eyes and short gray-streaked hair, wearing a simple jacket the color of deep water. Carrying nothing in her hands, she walked off the shuttle and smiled at the greeting party as though she had been here before. And perhaps in some sense that nobody at Varath fully understood yet, she had the trouble started before the first formal session even began. The security systems at Varath's outer bay flagged Ambassador Chen's arrival in the standard way: biometric scan, atmospheric analysis, a non-invasive health screening, and then all three systems rebooted simultaneously without cause. The backup systems came online, then they rebooted too. The station's chief security officer, a broad-shouldered Calder woman named Commander Vesh, stood at her console and watched every automated process on the outer bay quietly redirect itself. Not shutting down, not malfunctioning, and simply reorganizing around Yael Chen's presence, the way water reorganizes around a stone. "It's not hostile," Yael said from across the bay, without being asked and without turning around. "They are just saying hello. I apologize. They were always a little enthusiastic about new places." Commander Vesh stared at the back of the ambassador's head. "Who are they?" she asked. Yael turned, and her smile was patient and a little sad, in a way that Vesh could not explain. "The systems," Yael said simply. "They remember us." The first formal diplomatic session was held in Varath's Grand Chamber, a wide circular room with a domed ceiling. Painted in a star map of the known galaxy, surrounded by the flags and banners of every recognized civilization, Yael Chen sat at one end of the long central table. Across from her sat Admiral Korath Sel, representing the Calder Republic's military council, flanked by 6 senior diplomats who had each spent weeks preparing for this meeting. Also present, via secure holographic link, were representatives of the Veth Dominion and a single member of the Sorun Collective. To a soft-spoken historian and archivist who had asked to observe and had been given permission on the understanding that the Sorun were neutral. The historian's name was Archivist Sul. And while everyone else in the room was looking at Yael Chen, Sul was looking at the star map on the ceiling. Korath Sel began with the formal questions. Who governed humanity now? How many ships did they have? What were their territorial intentions? Or what did they want? Yael answered each question with precision, and without rushing. Humanity had no single governor. They operated as a distributed consensus. They had more ships than she was prepared to enumerate in this meeting. They had no territorial intentions toward any currently inhabited system. And what they wanted, she said, was to fulfill an old promise that had been left unfinished for 400,000 years. What promise? Korath Sel asked. The first Galactic Compact, Yael said. We helped write it. We would like to see it honored the way it was meant to be honored. The room went quiet, in the particular way that rooms go quiet when something has been said that everyone understood, but nobody wanted to be the first to respond to. It was Archivist Sul who spoke next, and not to Yael. But to the room, "There is something the Grand Archive does not say," Sul said in a voice like dry paper. "Something that was removed. I found the gaps 3 days ago when I began searching in preparation for this meeting. The gaps are not accidental." Every head in the room turned toward Sul. "The current territorial boundaries of the Veth Dominion," Sul continued, pulling up a slowly rotating map. "These relay stations along the outer corridor. These terraformed worlds in the mid-sectors. These jump route markers that every ship in the known galaxy uses to navigate. They are not Veth constructions. They are not Calder constructions. They predate every civilization currently sitting at this table by 380,000 years. The silence that followed was of a different kind than before. "They are human infrastructure," Sul said. "To a built by humanity. abandoned when humanity left, and claimed, repurposed, and quietly renamed by every power that came after. The Veth representative's hologram flickered, whether from a technical issue or from the representative's composure, but nobody could be sure. Korath Sel looked at Yael. Chen Yael had not moved, had not changed her expression, had simply sat with her hands folded on the table in the manner of someone waiting for the last piece of a familiar story to be told. "You knew," Korath Sel said, and it was not quite an accusation and not quite a question. "We were there," Yael said. "And you are not angry?" He asked. Yael considered this with genuine care, the way she considered everything without hurry. "I do not call them a thief. You do not call them a thief. You ask yourself why you did not stay to help them use it properly." She looked around the table, at the Calder diplomats, at the flickering Veth hologram, and at Archivist Sewell, who was still staring at the ceiling star map. "That is why we came back," she said. "Not to reclaim, not to punish, to stay this time." Archivist Sewell finally looked down from the ceiling. "There is one more thing the archive removed," Sewell said quietly. "The reason humanity left in the first place, it was not their choice. A coalition of younger species asked them to go. They were afraid of human power, and humanity agreed. They packed everything they could carry, and they left without a single act of violence." The room was very still. "They left us gifts," Sewell said, "and we erased the memory of who gave them." Yael Chen looked at the old archivist with an expression that was not anger and not grief. Something older than both. A something that had been carried for a very long time and had grown quiet and heavy with age. "We remember," she said. "We have always remembered. We simply decided that the memory was not more important than the future." Outside the Grand Chamber's high windows, a Verith station continued its orbit above the Calder capital, busy and bright and humming with the movement of 10,000 people going about their ordinary lives, none of them yet fully understanding what had just been said in the room above their heads, or how completely it would change everything they thought they knew about the history of the galaxy they lived in. #once the ancients. We returned, and the galaxy was unprepared. Part 3. The Weight of Old Names. The Veth Dominion's War Council met in secret 3 days after the Verith sessions ended. There were 12 members seated around the obsidian table in the deep chamber beneath the Dominion's capital city, generals and administrators and intelligence directors, all of them hard and practical and shaped by a civilization that had spent 400,000 years believing it was the sharpest thing in the known galaxy. Warlord Prime Skoth sat at the head of the table. He was old by Veth standards, his outer carapace worn to a dull gray at the edges, his 4 compound eyes patient and cold above the ridge of his jaw. He listened to the intelligence reports in silence. He listened to the energy readings from Solara Prime, the structure the size of a moon, outputting more power than the Calder Republic's entire grid. He listened to the technology assessment. Every system the Veth had borrowed from human ruins, now confirmed as human in origin, far more advanced than anything any current civilization had independently built. He listened to the report on Archivist Sewell's discovery, the deleted archive entries, the history of humanity's departure, the fact that the entire Dominion's outer infrastructure was built on a foundation that humanity had laid and walked away from. When the last report was finished, Skoth was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "They are an existential threat. We classify them as such. We begin building." One of the younger generals, a sharp-minded officer named Dreth Prime, on no relation to the soldier who would soon change everything, leaned forward. "We build against something that disabled our entire border fleet without raising a weapon," Dreth Prime said. "We build because that is what we do," Skath said, and the room did not argue further. The world the Veth called Keth Moras sat in the mid-sectors. a green and brown planet with wide, shallow seas and long, flat plains that grew three of the Dominion's primary agricultural exports. Ambassador Yael Chen had asked in a quiet and polite way that left no real room for refusal to visit it. The Calder Diplomatic Corps had arranged it, partly as a gesture of goodwill, partly to see what the human ambassador would do when she stood on soil that her people had once called their own, the world the Veth called Keth Morris. Humanity called New Carthage. Yael arrived by shuttle with a small observation team and no security detail of her own. The Veth assigned her an escort, 6 soldiers in full patrol armor, led by a young sergeant named Dreth, 22 years old, 3 years into his service, and the kind of soldier who followed orders precisely because he had not yet found a reason to do otherwise. Dreth had spent his whole life learning that humanity was a myth, a cautionary tale told by historians to explain why the galaxy should fear concentrated power. And now he was walking 3 paces behind a human woman through the old district of Keth Moras, where the ruins of the previous civilization had been carefully paved over and built upon. The ruins were still visible in places. Corners of old walls sticking up between newer buildings, archways too large for Veth proportions standing in the middles of public squares, road patterns that ran in directions no Veth city planner would have chosen because they had been laid down for a different kind of foot. Yael walked slowly. She did not take notes or photographs. She simply looked at things in the quiet way of someone reading a very old book they had read before. Dreth watched her from his 3 paces back and said nothing. Then they came to the old plaza, a wide open space at the center of the original settlement. Where the paving stones were a different color because they were older and had come from somewhere else. And Yael stopped. She stood in the center of the plaza and looked up at the sky. Then she sat down on the old stones, simply sat down, cross-legged, in the middle of the plaza. And she wept not loudly, not with the shaking grief of someone in acute pain, but quietly and steadily, in the way rain falls in a place that needs it. Dreth's soldiers exchanged glances above their helmets. Dreth himself took 2 steps forward, stopped, then took 1 more and crouched down to Yael's eye level. He's setting the butt of his patrol rifle on the stones beside him. "Ambassador," he said carefully, Are you well?" Yael pressed the back of her hand to her eye and looked at him. And what he saw in her face was not what he had been trained to expect from an existential threat. It was grief, plain and old and heavy. "People lived here," she said. "They built this plaza. They brought these stones from another continent because they thought the color was beautiful. There were children who played here and old people who sat here in the evenings, and they are completely gone. And the galaxy moved over the top of them and forgot they had names." Dreth sat on the stones beside her. He was not sure why he did it. It was not protocol. But something about the moment made protocol feel very small and far away. "What were their names?" he asked. Yael looked at him with an expression of genuine surprise, as though nobody had asked that in a very long time. She began to speak. "Name after name, family after family. It's the old record of New Carthage's population pulled from humanity's own deep archives." And her voice was steady, and she did not rush. Dreth listened to every name. When she was done, he was quiet for a while. Then he asked the question he had been carrying since the day he was assigned to this escort. The question that had been growing louder the longer he spent near her. "What are you, really?" he asked. "Not what the War Council says? Not what the history modules taught? What are you?" Actually," Yael looked at the old stones of the plaza for a moment. "We are the species that learn to outlive our mistakes," she said. "We did not ascend because we became perfect. We ascended because we finally and fully accepted that we never would be. And we stopped letting that truth break us. We let it teach us instead." Dreth looked at the old paving stones beneath his boots. at the color difference, where the ancient human stones met the Veth construction around them, the war. The council voted to classify you as an existential threat, he said. I know, she said. They are going to build against you, he said. I know that too, she said. Are you afraid? He asked. Yael looked up at the wide, shallow sky of Keithmoras, of New Carthage, and for a moment she looked not like a diplomat or an ancient returned from beyond the stars, but like a person sitting on old stones in a city that had once belonged to people with names not of what your war council will build, she. We left behind did more harm than good. We left behind did more harm than good because we were not here to help with them. She stood up and brushed the dust from her jacket. That is why we came back, she said, not because the galaxy needs us to be in charge, but because we left a mess when we left the first time, and we would like to help clean it up. If anyone will let us. Dreth stood up beside her. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he did something that surprised even himself. He removed his helmet and tucked it under his arm, the Veth military gesture of lowering one's guard, which no Veth soldier was supposed to do in the presence of a classified existential threat. I will let you, he said. He did not know yet what that decision would cost him or what it would eventually mean for the galaxy. He only knew that it was the most honest thing he had said in 3 years of service, and for the first time in 3 years of service, he felt like himself, #once the ancients we returned, and the galaxy was unprepared. Part 4. When Ancients Go to War. The fleet assembled in secret, though nothing that large can stay secret for very long 12,000 Veth warships, pulled from every border garrison, every patrol route, and every reserve dock in the Dominion, gathered in the dark of the fringe corridor over the course of 18 days, moving in small groups through unmapped jump corridors to avoid long-range Calder sensor arrays. Warlord Prime Skyath had called it Operation First Silence. The name was chosen with care, a reference to the first and only time in recorded Veth history that an enemy had been made permanently quiet before they could act. The target was the UNSS Enduring Patience, the single human vessel that had made first contact at Solara Prime. The same ship that had served as Ambassador Yael Chen's point of origin and return throughout the diplomatic sessions at Verath Intelligence, had tracked its current position to a quiet region of the fringe corridor, relatively empty space, no nearby populated systems, no Calder observation posts within response range. Skath had chosen the location deliberately. He did not want witnesses to the first strike. He wanted a clean and total result. The human ship destroyed, a message sent before humanity could establish any deeper presence in the galaxy, and the diplomatic sessions rendered moot by the simple fact that their ambassador had no ship to return to. It was, by the Veth Dominion's standards, a completely rational decision. The fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a wide formation around the Enduring Patience's last known coordinates, and for 3 full seconds, that every sensor operator on every Veth bridge searched their screens for a target. The Enduring Patience was exactly where intelligence had placed it, sitting alone in the dark, unhurried, silver-white and perfect and still. 12,000 warships settled into position around a single vessel. From the outside, it must have looked to anyone watching from far enough away like a sea surrounding a single stone. Skaith gave the weapons lock order. 12,000 targeting systems came online at once. Then every single one of them went dark, not gradually, not with error messages or system warnings or the staged failure of components, all at once, simultaneously, as though a single switch had been thrown in every ship at the same moment. Then the propulsion systems went offline. Then the long-range communications arrays went silent. Then, one by one, in a sequence so methodical it felt almost gentle, every offensive system across the entire Veth fleet simply stopped responding to its operators. Life support remained fully active. Internal lighting stayed on gravity plating held. The crews of 12,000 warships sat in their sealed and perfectly safe and completely powerless ships and looked at the enduring patience sitting exactly where it had been, unchanged, unscratched, but still unhurried. The silence on Scoth's flagship bridge was the loudest silence he had ever sat inside. Then the voice came, the same voice that had spoken at Solara Prime, warm and calm and carrying no anger. It came through the emergency intercoms on every ship, the hardwired systems that ran on independent power cells and could not be shut down remotely. "We felt this coming," the voice said. "We want you to know that we are not angry. What you did today came from fear, and then fear is something we understand very well. But we will not be struck. Not now. Be not again. Take the time you need to think. Your ships will be returned to you when this conversation is finished." Scath stared at his dead weapons console. He was not a man who felt fear easily. He had commanded fleets in 3 wars and had never once flinched at a targeting alarm. But what he felt in that moment was not the clean fear of battle. It was the deep and quiet fear of something that cannot be measured, cannot be outrun, and is not angry at you, which is somehow more frightening than something that is. He had been prepared for a fight. He had not been prepared for patience. Then his communications officer made a sharp sound from across the bridge. "Warlord Prime," she said, and her voice was not steady. "The Doomsday contingency has been triggered. Automated signal from the secondary command node. The weapon at Station Vareth 7 is arming." The Doomsday contingency had been Scoth's insurance, a last resort, that he had never genuinely expected to use and had certainly not authorized anyone to trigger without his direct order. Station Vareth 7 sat at the edge of Soruon space, a decommissioned Veth weapons platform, supposedly inactive, secretly maintained, carrying a singularity charge large enough to destabilize a planet's core. It had been aimed with great care and deliberate cruelty at a Soruon civilian world, a planet of 40 million people who had nothing to do with any of this. Someone in the secondary command chain had panicked and activated it. Scoth closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and said, "Can we stop it from here?" "No, Warlord Prime," his officer said. "We have no comms. No propulsion. The charge will fire in 4 minutes. 4 minutes and 40 million people and a dead world. Scoth said nothing. He had no words for what was happening. Because what was happening was the worst version of the thing he had built, running without him. I aimed at people who had never once threatened his empire. The next 80 seconds were the longest of his life. Then, on every bridge screen across every dead ship in the fleet, the long-range sensor arrays came back online for exactly long enough to show them what happened next. 3 human ships materialized between Station Vareth 7 and the Soruon world. They had not been there before, not on any scan, not on any sensor reading, not on any piece of intelligence the Dominion had gathered in 18 days of careful preparation. They had simply not been visible until they chose to be the singularity charge fired. The 3 human ships did not move out of the way. They absorbed it. The charge struck the lead vessel and vanished. Not in an explosion, not in a shockwave, not in any visible release of energy. It simply ceased to exist, as though the ship had reached out and quietly closed a door. The Soruon world continued its orbit, untouched, its 40 million people unaware of how close the sky had just come to ending. And on Scath's bridge, the sensors showed one final thing: the secondary command node where the contingency had been triggered, a sealed and armored bunker in the Dominion's capital city. And inside it, seated in a chair with human restraints at his wrists and a human guard standing quietly at the door, was the officer who had triggered the contingency. He had been removed from that room before the charge even fired. Nobody on his ship had seen it happen. Nobody had seen anyone enter or leave. He was simply no longer where he had been, and Scoth looking at the sensor image of his own officer sitting in that chair with human restraints on his wrists. I'd understood with perfect clarity what the voice on the intercom had meant. Not angry, not careless, not absent, just patient and ready. And already 3 steps ahead of everything, Scath had built his entire career believing made him dangerous. "Open a channel," Scath said quietly to his communications officer. "Sir, our comms are down," she said. "Try," he said. She tried. The channel opened immediately, as though it had been waiting. "We are ready to talk," Scath said. "We know," the voice said, and it was still warm. And it was still calm, and it carried no victory in it at all. Only the sound of something very old and very tired of watching the same mistakes repeat themselves across the long, dark centuries. "We have always been ready to talk. We were hoping you would get here eventually." The fleet drifted in the dark of the fringe corridor. 12,000 ships, perfectly intact, perfectly unharmed. I'd waiting for their systems to come back. No human life had been lost. No Veth life had been lost. Not a single weapon had been fired in return. The galaxy watched through long-range sensors from a careful distance, and in the quiet that followed, the word spread from observer to observer and station to station and world to world, not as a military report, so not as a diplomatic dispatch, as something closer to a story that people told because they could not stop thinking about it. Humanity had been surrounded by 12,000 warships, and they had ended it without raising a hand, hashtag. Once the ancients, we returned, and the galaxy was unprepared, 1-5. We did not come back to rule. The Grand Hall of the Galactic Compact had not been full in over 200 years. It was a great circular chamber on Vareth Station, wide enough to seat 300 delegations, with a domed ceiling made entirely of transparent alloy that let the stars show through at all hours. And it had sat mostly empty for 2 centuries because the Galactic Compact itself had sat mostly empty. Are a structure without meaning, a document without believers. You're a table at which nobody important had chosen to sit for a very long time. Now every seat was filled. Delegates from the Calder Republic sat in their formal gray, tense and watchful and trying not to show it. Alongside representatives from 47 smaller states and border territories who had traveled for days to be present for something they could feel in the way that living things can feel a change in the air before a storm. The Soruan Collective's delegation sat in a long, quiet row. Was noticeably younger than the one that was noticeably younger than the one that had sat at Varath 3 weeks earlier, because Warlord Prime Scoth was in a human holding facility, and 3 of his senior generals had resigned within 48 hours of the events in the fringe corridor, and in a seat at the very back of the hall, in civilian clothes with his patrol helmet nowhere to be seen, sat Sergeant Dreth, who had requested emergency leave, been denied it, gone anyway, and was waiting to see what happened before deciding what came next. Ambassador Yael Chen walked to the center of the hall. She did not walk to the speaking podium. She walked to the open floor in the middle of the chamber, the circular space that the original architects had designed as a place where no one nation sat above any other. And she stood there without notes, without a prepared screen, and she spoke, "We owe you an apology." She spoke, "We owe you an apology," she said. The room had been ready for many things, a declaration, a demand, a list of terms, an announcement of humanity's intentions for the galaxy's political future. It had not been ready for an apology. "When we left," Yael said, "we left in a hurry, and we left behind more than infrastructure. We left behind a shape in the galaxy that we had made by existing in it for so long, and when we stepped out of that shape, everything around it shifted to fill the space, and not always in ways that were good for the people filling it, that is on us. We were old enough and wise enough to have known better, and we left anyway, because it was easier than staying and doing the difficult work of sharing the galaxy with people who were afraid of us. She paused. Not for effect, but because she meant every word, and she wanted to make sure she gave each one the weight it deserved. "We cannot undo what was paved over," she said. "We cannot give back the names that were forgotten or the history that was removed from archives. What we can do is stay this time. Not as rulers, not as governors, not as the civilization that built the foundation and therefore owns the house, but as members, equal members, with one voice at this table, the same as every other voice." She reached into her jacket and placed a document on the floor in front of her. A physical document, printed on something that was not quite paper, and covered in writing in a dozen languages. "This is the original First Galactic Compact," she said, "the version we helped write, before it was simplified and repurposed and eventually emptied of the things that made it worth signing: equal representation, shared technology, free movement, collective defense, not of empires, but of people, all people, and regardless of what civilization they came from or what their civilization had done." She looked at the Sorun delegation. "We see you," she said. She looked at the representatives of the small border states who had traveled days to be here. "We see you," she said. She looked at the young Veth delegation in their unfamiliar seats. "We see you," she said. And then, from the back of the hall in civilian clothes, "Without rank or standing or any official right to speak in this chamber," Sergeant Dreth stood up. The room noticed immediately a Calder protocol officer started to rise, then stopped when nobody else rose with her. Dreth stood for a moment in the silence of 300 watching delegations. Then he walked down through the tiered seating to the open floor. He crossed the circular space and stood beside Yael Chen. He did not say anything. He simply stood there, on a Veth soldier in civilian clothes, beside a human ambassador in the center of the Galactic Compact's Grand Hall, and the image of it traveled through the room in the way that images sometimes do when they mean more than words can carry. Then 2 of the younger Veth delegates stood up, then 3 Calder junior diplomats, then a Sorun representative who had been sitting in perfect stillness for 2 hours, unfolded herself and walked to the floor one by one. Not everyone. Not immediately. But steadily, in the way that honest things grow, people came to the open floor, not as a performance, as a choice. 3 weeks later, in a human holding facility on a neutral station, Warlord Prime Skath sat across a plain table from a human guard. A young man, barely older than Dreth had been on the old Plaza Stones of New Carthage, who had been assigned to his cell rotation and who, unlike most of his colleagues, he seemed genuinely curious about the Warlord Prime rather than cautious. After 4 days of silence between them, Skath asked the question that had been living in him since the moment his fleet had been neutralized without a shot fired. "Why did you not destroy us?" he asked. "You could have. Every scan, every assessment, everything I know about power and the way civilizations use it says that you could have ended my fleet in the fringe corridor and ended this conversation before it started. Why did you not?" The young guard was quiet for a moment. He looked at Skath the way that young people sometimes look at old questions, without the weariness that comes from having asked them too many times. "Because you'll do better," he said. "They always do. Given time." Skath looked at the plain wall of his cell. "How can you know that?" he asked. "We've been watching a long time," the guard said, and there was no arrogance in it, no satisfaction, only the simple and steady certainty of someone reporting an observed fact. "Every species that ever sat across from us in something like this room eventually did better, not perfectly, not without failing again in smaller ways, but better. You will too." Skath said nothing for a while. Then he said, "The young sergeant, Dreth, my government has classified him as a traitor." "I know," the guard said. "He stood in front of 300 delegations." Skath said. "I know," the guard said. "And again, "He has no protection," Scath said. The guard looked at him with an expression that was not unkind. "He has us," the guard said. Back at Solara Prime, the cradle hung in orbit. The great structure the size of a moon, humanity's original homeworld, transformed long ago into a ship that had carried an entire civilization beyond the known galaxy and back again, slowly unfurling its outer levels now, section by section. The way a long-closed building opens its windows when people move back in, children ran on its newly accessible decks. Human children born during the long ascension, who had grown up with stars all around them and no fixed ground beneath their feet, pressing their faces to the wide viewports and looking out at the galaxy their parents had told them about in careful and loving detail. For 400,000 years, Yael stood at a viewport on the cradle's upper level. Beside her stood an elder, one of the very few who had been alive at the original departure, who carried the memory of the leaving not as history, but as something that had happened to him personally, something he had felt in his own body on a specific day, with a specific sky above him. He watched the children run. "They are still afraid of us," he said. Yael did not look away from the stars. "They were afraid of us last time too," she said. The elder was quiet. "What changed?" he asked. Yael thought about the plaza in New Carthage, the old stones, the different colored paving, of the young Veth soldier who had sat beside her and asked for the names of people long gone. "We asked for their names," she said. "We sat down on their ground and we asked for their names, and then we listened." The elder nodded slowly. Outside, the children were still running, and the galaxy, vast and old and full of civilizations that were afraid and brave and mistaken and trying and alive, turned on in the dark with all its ordinary and extraordinary motion. It was not fixed. It was not finished. But for the first time in 400,000 years, there was a seat at the table, an open floor in a great circular hall, and someone had chosen to stand on it not to rule but to stay. And that, in the long, slow history of the galaxy, was the rarest and most difficult thing of all,